one of the things you definitely hear from skeptics, and even sadly, even in the people who would identify themselves as Christians. Of course, I mentioned that my book is about progressive Christianity. So, in a lot of cases, not all, progressive Christians have sort of denied the resurrection of Jesus, at least as it being a physical resurrection. In the progressive world, it's like, well, whether or not he was really raised physically doesn't really matter. And then, of course, skeptics are going to say there's no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the things that really was so just exciting for me to learn was that there is actually a lot of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, I argue, and I think this is true. I'm not saying you can prove the resurrection outside of the Bible, but even if you never opened a Bible in your life, there would be enough historical evidence from non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life to get to that conclusion, because even secular scholars will admit that the earliest followers of Jesus had an experience in which they believed they had seen the risen Christ, and then they were willing to go to their deaths and they were willing to be tortured and beaten, holding that belief was true. And it's really interesting when you ask skeptics, what do you make of that? If he wasn't really resurrected, what's the answer? And they come up with a bunch of things that don't really work. But the good news is there actually is quite a bit of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And so there's a scholar, a historian, Gary Habermas, and he collected over 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works on the resurrection between 1975 and 2003. Now, this spanned the gamut of the most conservative scholars to the most liberal to even atheist and, hostile biblical scholars to the resurrection. And he discovered that there were certain facts that virtually every scholar agreed upon. And so he lays these out. And so four of those facts would be, number one, virtually every scholar agrees that Jesus, well, first of all, existed. You're always going to have your outliers on the fringe, but that Jesus existed and was crucified in the Roman Empire. So he died by Roman crucifixion. So that's the first fact that virtually every scholar agrees on. The second fact that virtually every scholar agrees on is that Jesus' disciples believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them, and that they were willing to suffer and die for those beliefs. And then there's a couple more facts they all agree on, and that's that Paul, who went from being not just skeptical, but an actual persecutor of the church, breathing threats and murder against Christians, instantly flipped after having an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus. Now, I'm wording that the way the skeptical scholars would word it. We, of course, know that Paul did see the risen Jesus, but the skeptic might say that he believed he'd seen the risen Jesus. But the point is that his life flipped on a dime from that one experience. He went from literally bringing Christians to their deaths with Stephen the martyr, his cloaks being put at Paul's feet, to becoming like one of the greatest evangelists of all time and writing a good chunk of our New Testament. And then the fourth fact that virtually all scholars agree on is that Jesus' brother James was skeptical. The Bible talks about Jesus' own brothers didn't even believe in him. And he was suddenly converted after he believed he had seen the risen Jesus. And Paul writes about James's eyewitness account in 1 Corinthians 15, where he lists out all these eyewitnesses. Paul lists 500 other eyewitnesses that, by the way, most of them at least would have been alive during the time that Paul wrote about them. And if that wasn't true, Paul wouldn't have written that, because they all could have been like, wait a second, you're saying I saw something I didn't see, but nobody ever did anything like that. And then there's one more fact that fewer scholars believe, but still about 75% of scholars believe that Jesus' tomb was found empty. And so the thing I just love to ask people is, given all those facts, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, his disciples believed they'd seen the risen Jesus and were willing to suffer and die for that belief. We've got Paul, the skeptic, flipping on a dime, and James flipping on a dime, who was skeptical. I mean, this was Jesus' brother, right? Like your little brother's the big brother's the Messiah. I mean, that's a hard sell. But he becomes the leader of the church in Rome, as we know. So there's all these facts. And so the thing I just like to ask people is, how do you explain those facts? And it's interesting just to watch people kind of think about that. And so I have another blog post where I list some quotes from some different scholars. So there's an atheist, Gerd Ludemann, a German New Testament scholar, and he wrote that it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Now, this is not a guy that believes that the New Testament is even historically reliable, but he's saying this is a fact. Of course, Bart Ehrman, we mentioned as the skeptical scholar that grew up as a Christian, walked away from his faith. And he wrote this. He said, historians have no difficulty speaking about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus, since this is a matter of public record. It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. And then he wrote in a blog post, I pulled this from one of his blog posts, he said, the most important thing to stress is that there are two historical realities that simply cannot be denied. The followers of Jesus did claim that he came back to life, and if they had not claimed that, we would not have Christianity. And then, of course, N.T. Wright, there's a famous quote from him where he says, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Because, of course, we know there were other people claiming to be the Jewish Messiah that were killed, and that those stories just faded out. The only thing that explains Christianity getting off the ground is that Jesus actually was resurrected from the dead. And so those are just sort of some of what Gary Habermas refers to as the minimal facts. Those are the minimal facts, just the most basic things that all scholars agree on. And the question for everyone listening is, how do you explain those facts? Because there's different ways people will try to, but it's a lot more plausible that the best explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, would you consider supporting this ministry by giving a donation of any amount? You can do so by going to our website, rightresponseministries.com. Let's be frank. Sadly, many evangelical pastors and leaders are serving as nothing more than water carriers for the political left. Just as those in the political left hate you, just like those corporations that are left-leaning hate you, these pastors and evangelical leaders hate you. I know that's a strong statement to make. I'm aware of that, but it's true. They don't care about your personal liberty. They don't care about your freedom. They want you to love your neighbor at the expense of biblical truth, even if it means bearing false witness. That's not us. We're different. We're not the only ones. I don't want to be arrogant. God has reserved a remnant for himself in this time, as he has all other ages and all other places, but they are few and far between. It's called a remnant for a reason. We need your help. We want to stand up to tyranny. We want to stand up to this new left totalitarian regime. We want to defend Christians and people, the salt of the earth, who love America and who love God's word. But we can't do it without your help. If you're not prepared or able to give a financial gift, one way that you can support this ministry is by simply subscribing to our YouTube channel and clicking the bell so that you'll be notified as we come out with new content. You can also help us by sharing our content on all your social media platforms so that more people can hear the truth of God's word with courage and fidelity. Thanks for tuning in. God bless.